Bibliophiles of the internet, I'm Adri, and today I'm here to bring you my November wrap-up. So November officially marked 8 years of me being on BookTube. I didn't have time to make a special post or video about it, but that doesn't make it any less real, so that's really exciting. And November was also Nonfiction November and Indigathon, so that extends to a majority of my reading selections. Jumping right in, the first book I finished in November was one I actually started in October, and that was Cazadora by Romina Garber. This recently came out in August, and I was kindly sent a finished copy by Wednesday Books. It's the sequel to Lobezona, which follows an Argentinian-American immigrant named Manu, who's been hidden her entire life, both because of her mysterious star-shaped pupils and her undocumented status. When her mother is detained by ICE, Manu finds herself on the run and stumbles into a hidden magical world of brujas and lobezones that she never knew existed, only to learn that she herself is part of it. Content warnings for instances of sexism and gender essentialism, some violence, injury, and death, some references to extreme menstrual pain, brief mention of teenage pregnancy, miscarriage, and postpartum depression, and some fade to black sexual content. I really enjoyed this. Going into this sequel having enjoyed the first book so much, of course there were high expectations, but I was pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to fall back into this world with these characters, even though the ending of that first book was so complex. I think this sequel does a really good job of organically embedding subtle recaps of the first book throughout the narrative as you go, so even if you don't perfectly recall every single thing that happened in book 1, you will always have the necessary context. I was also really impressed by the fast pace of this installment. The story is constantly barreling forward and new plot points are cropping up every few pages, which really keeps you on your toes. And while there's a risk that those elements can feel underexplored, I think that structure sort of emulates Manu's own experience of being constantly on the move and unable to rest. There's no shortage of adventure and intrigue throughout this installment, and I think that also serves to drive home exactly what's at stake and how Manu is being hunted from all sides. And much like the first book, I think this story is just empowering in the way it challenges oppressive systems, binary systems, and how it consistently puts forth the message that personhood is far more important than circumstance. Manu continues to be this really compelling hero who shows the importance and the necessity of finding new ways to live and to exist. With the introduction of the Coven, I think the story also raises really interesting questions of what it means to be marginalized, what it means to be an outsider, how many people are actually excluded and harmed by systems of power, and what it means to abolish those systems. Kind of going back to what I said earlier, there were some moments that felt a bit rushed, and I'm also not super confident if this concludes the duology or if there's going to be another installment, because that would affect my reading of the ending, but either way, I gave this a solid 4 stars. Around the same time, I was also reading This Wound is a World by Billy Ray Belcourt. Billy Ray Belcourt is a queer poet and writer of the Driftpile First Nation, and this is actually his debut poetry collection, and it centers a lot on the idea of how Indigenous peoples navigate grief, pain, and sadness in relation to love and sometimes sex. Content warnings for death and reference to mass murder, some references to suicide and anti-Indigenous violence, homophobic slurs, and some graphic depictions of sex. Billy Ray Belcourt has solidified himself as one of my favorite poets, especially because he has such a profound and radical approach to language. He writes in a way that feels both accessible and visceral, and he keeps the reader engaged by repurposing language in really surprising ways. One of the recurring themes in this collection is the idea of how colonialism extends to the forceful inhabitation and policing of bodies, especially when it comes to Indigenous peoples. It almost becomes like a refrain that echoes throughout this collection, this idea of your body and your very existence being exploited, disrespected, and feeling like it only exists for other people's benefit. There's also a really powerful thread about wanting to be loved because of and through indigeneity and not in spite of it. And as Belcourt works through those ideas, the relationships he's able to draw between reality, imagination, and futurity are as haunting and striking as they are beautiful, and there's just a magic to the way he's able to create new meaning in the way he writes. I love this, and I definitely want to read more of his poetry. I gave this collection 5 stars. The next book I read is a review book coming out very early next year, so it's the only other exception, and that was Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. It's a queer adult rom-com starring a queer woman and a queer non-binary person as written by a non-binary author, and it comes out on January 18th from Forever Press. The 2 main characters are amateur chefs who are cast in a reality cooking competition that could very well change both of their lives. Dolly Woodson is trying to reinvent herself after a recent divorce, which has put her on the edge of bankruptcy. She also quit her job to go on this cooking show, knowing that the prize money could very well make a huge difference in helping her start a new chapter of her life. London Parker, on the other hand, has come into this competition wanting to be the first out and proud non-binary contestant on the show, and then hopefully put the prize money towards creating their own queer nonprofit. These two could not be any more different, and they know they should be focusing on perfecting their craft, but their off-camera interactions are making it difficult to keep their eyes on the prize. Content warnings for explorations of divorce and job loss, instances of transphobia, brief descriptions of blood and cooking-related injuries, and some sexually explicit content. I blew through this book so quickly. It's such an enjoyable story to read. It has a great will they won't they slow burn romance, and it's a great balance of humor, quirkiness, steaminess, sentimentality, and cooking montages. I'm a very simple person, and I enjoy all of those things. And even though I don't relate to London in many ways, it was almost healing to read this story because it's rare to have non-binary romantic heroes in romance or in any kind of story. So to see them as this worthy, successful, desirable love interest was weirdly cathartic. And I also just enjoy how tropey this romance is. It has cooking, reality television, competitors turned lovers, a grumpy sunshine relationship dynamic. It just checks off a lot of boxes. I think the story is able to strike a very fine balance between cooking content and relationship development. You definitely see enough of Dahlia and London in the kitchen to understand their cooking skills, but they still spend plenty of time getting to know each other off camera as well. I also really appreciate how the story celebrates messiness and uncertainty, especially when it comes to Dahlia, and how not having all the answers yet doesn't make you a failure, which I think is rare to see in adult romances. There's often this idea that gaining something is the only way to be accomplished, and we rarely think of losing something or walking away from something as being an accomplishment. But both of these characters are learning how to grow by recognizing things that are no longer working in their life, and that's an equally valid and important kind of success. I do think Dahlia has more significant character growth, mostly because London's primary obstacle is navigating transphobia, which is a very real barrier and experience, but overall, besides that, it feels like they have less at stake. And I also feel like there's some really staggering differences in social status, income, wealth, and money sense between Dahlia and London that I wish was better addressed by the end of the book. I will link my written review down below if you want to see more of my thoughts on that or anything else, but overall this was a really fun, sweet, and heartfelt cooking romance, and I'm very excited to read more from this author in the future. I gave this 4 stars. After that, I listened to Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's first book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses. This is scientific nonfiction with very brief memoir-like interludes, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a close examination of the functions and life cycles of moss. It explores how mosses are a fundamental part of our ecosystem, how she understands them as both a scientist and indigenous traditionalist, and how mosses are intricately intertwined with countless other beings and species. I don't have much to say about this, not because I didn't enjoy it, but because I'm not a very scientifically minded person, and even though I can definitely say that I know more now about moss than I ever have before in my life, I can't actually articulate all of those facts. I will say that this book is very much the predecessor to Braiding Sweetgrass. You can see little inklings of where the idea for that book came from as you go through this one, and even though it's much more focused on one kind of plant, it has that same visceral connection between the personal and the scientific. By incorporating little snippets of her life, her culture, and the circumstances surrounding her research, Dr. Kimmerer is able to bring a very human side to the science, and really contextualize these microscopic biological details in really compelling ways. She has such a unique and powerful way of understanding science and biological connectivity that really resonates, even if you don't have a background in science. As you learn more about the biological properties and movements of moss, she helps you to feel that same kind of amazement and reverence that she feels for moss, and to recognize the importance of observing and respecting the world around us. If you enjoyed Braiding Sweetgrass, I think you'll definitely enjoy this as well. I would happily read any book from this author on any subject, and I gave this a resounding 5 stars. Then for my library, I listened to The Removed by Brandon Hobson, read by Delana Studi, Gary Farmer, and Sean Taylor Corbett. This is a multi-POV contemporary story following a Cherokee family who tragically lost their 15-year-old son to police violence. Ever since Ray Ray passed away, the family's kind of been suspended in their grief, but they come together annually to commemorate Ray Ray's life at a family bonfire during the Cherokee National Holiday, which is coming up as the story begins. Content warnings for mentions of child death and police killing, references to the genocide of indigenous peoples, mentions of meth addiction, some stalking and abuse, some descriptions of physical assault, degenerative disease, and explorations of anti-indigenous racism and violence. I was really blown away by this book. I haven't read the author's previous work, but now I definitely intend to seek it out because this was such a visceral reading experience. It really is just a close, almost quiet character study of this family and how they're trying trying to find their way back to each other even through trauma and hardship. And what really struck me about the story is that it touches on some really heavy topics like addiction, abuse, police violence, but it doesn't live in those traumatic experiences. What I mean by that is no one in this family is ever defined by what they've gone through, and the story never once exploits this family's pain or puts it on display for the reader's benefit. The story trusts you to connect the dots and recognize injustice and pain at face value, which is a really important skill to have. Even though the characters are working through their own issues, the story is more focused on healing and connection. Despite these characters isolating themselves, they remain connected to their beliefs and their culture in undeniable ways. It sends a really powerful message about how those intrinsic connections are not so easily dissolved or erased as we're led to think. And I appreciate that the title really does tell the whole story and can be interpreted in so many different ways. It can refer to the Cherokee Nation being removed from their land, the family being emotionally removed from their trauma, or even the family being removed from each other after enduring so much loss. The story masterfully weaves together conditions of the past, present, and future as it applies to this one family, and I think it's ultimately hopeful when it could have very easily gone in a different direction. I'm really glad I took the time to finally read this, and the audiobook is fantastically narrated as well. Overall, I gave this 4.5 stars. Then I read The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth, collected by the Red Nation. The Red Nation is a collective or coalition spearheaded by Indigenous activists and thinkers and aided by non-Indigenous allies and comrades with the goal of liberating Native peoples, and by extension all peoples, from capitalism and colonialism. This book serves as a broad overview of their mission statement, their values, their politics, what they're trying to collectively accomplish, and what the Land Back movement can and should look like. General content warnings for references to anti-Indigenous violence, police brutality, murder, racism, suicide rates, immigrant abuse, and discussions of sexual and gender violence. This is one of the best nonfiction books I have ever read, and I'm so mad that I finished it right after I posted my nonfiction recommendations video because this would have definitely made the cut. This is one of the most informative and decisive books I've ever read, especially in terms of politics, and I think especially if you live in the US or the global north, this is an essential book. It comprehensively breaks down the various oppressive systems and institutions like imperialism, the prison complex, capitalism, police forces that have a chokehold on the United States and that ensure the continued decline of both society and the planet's existence. It's a detailed yet accessible explanation of why we need to divest from these systems and prioritize abolition over reform when it comes to overhauling these deeply corrupt institutions founded on systemic oppression that will continue to function as they were intended to unless we commit ourselves to change. But even more than that, this book outlines the importance of the Land Back movement and really explores why Indigenous peoples not only continue to be the most effective caretakers of our planet, but why they should be centered in this movement. I appreciate how this presents a fully faceted exploration of how these systems and issues are intrinsically interconnected. There is, of course, the very pressing reality of climate change, but it's also connected to food insecurity, housing shortages, the school-to-prison pipeline, and so many other things. And I also really respect how they acknowledge that they're not the only organization working towards this goal. There are many other movements that seek similar changes, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and they also mention how some of the concepts they're proposing are following in the tradition of previous abolitionist movements. It's very complex, it's very ambitious, but through this thorough debrief on what those changes can and should look like, it's also clear that it's very possible as well, even if it's not going to happen overnight. I truly cannot recommend this book enough, especially as a comprehensive starting point. It is absolutely incredible, and I gave it 5 stars. And the last book I finished in November was my Patreon selection for the month, and that was Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley, read by Isabella Starr LeBlanc. Angeline Boulley is an Ojibwe author, and this is a contemporary YA mystery following a young Ojibwe college student named Donis who dreams of studying medicine. But everything changes when her community is ravaged by drug addiction and violence. The only silver lining for Donis is when a new boy named Jamie comes to town and quickly becomes a rising hockey star and very well liked among her friends. But after she's assigned to be his official ambassador, she realizes that he seems to be hiding something and keeping his own secrets. She quickly realizes what that is when she witnesses a shocking murder and becomes a crucial part of an ongoing investigation, and reluctantly she decides to go undercover and use her knowledge of both chemistry and traditional medicine to help track down the culprits. Content warnings for grief, death, murder, suicide, injury, and descriptions of dead bodies, underage drinking, references to drug abuse and addiction, misogyny, references to anti-Indigenous slurs and violence, gun violence, references to infidelity, instance of sexual assault, and some sexual content. I once again almost feel lost for words because this book is absolutely incredible and it deserves every shred of hype and recognition. It's both a love letter to Ojibwe culture and a really captivating mystery that makes you feel like you have to know what's going to happen next. One of my favorite parts of the story is Donis herself. She knows exactly who she is and what she believes. She is resolute in knowing the value of her culture and her people, and those things are never a cause for conflict. It's rare to have a YA mystery where the main character isn't morally ambiguous themselves, but that's what makes Donis feel so refreshing to me. She has faith in the people around her and in the traditions that she carries on, and she is often rewarded for having that faith. Which, to be clear, is not to say that she doesn't make mistakes, because she definitely does. But especially because she gets caught up in this police investigation, the authorities expect her to prejudge people within the community and find a singular person who's to blame. But she realizes that these drug issues are a symptom of a larger problem that's much more complex. For me, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of the story, how you have these undercover police bringing Donis into this investigation, which seems very contradictory on the surface. The police system is very strongly invested in upholding imperialism and colonialism, and they often play a role in further marginalizing already vulnerable communities, and as an Indigenous person, Donis seems to be in contention with those values. So I was reading it and I was thinking, this is pretty much like the colonized working for the colonizers, so how is Donis gonna walk this very fine line? But she somehow does. She wants to get to the bottom of this investigation because she wants to protect her community, and because she realizes that any solution affecting the community has to come from people within the community, and that they can't depend on outsiders to do that necessary work. Donis can't depend on the police to view this pervasive problem with compassion and insight, and because she has that perspective of being someone who understands and practices the traditional Ojibwe ways, she has a deep understanding of the community that outsiders could never have. So she's kind of playing both sides and making sure the police don't perpetuate any further harm in their investigation, but also deciding what is necessary for the police to know and what is not. And it shows that just because she's cooperating with this investigation doesn't mean she has to betray her beliefs, her values, or her people. She is trying to protect her community from the inside out. It ends up being a really nuanced exploration of the fraught relationship between Indigenous nations and police enforcement. And it discusses how the police are part of an institution held up by white supremacy and racism, but that doesn't mean that Donis, as an informer, has to further contribute to those issues. I also really appreciate how the story explores the really complex issue of tribal enrollment, and how it's not a straightforward process and it has very strong pros and cons. There's a lot of discussion about per capita laws and blood quantum and what it really means to belong to a native nation, legally or otherwise, and who these laws ultimately benefit. In theory, enrollment is supposed to afford you certain privileges or protections, but it doesn't always work that way, and sometimes procuring those things proves to be much more fraught and complex. And that's just one facet of this really incredible story. It's just enthralling and powerful and sheds light on so many issues that Indigenous communities face in a very realistic and human way. It was so satisfying to watch Donis's journey from beginning to end, and I cannot wait for this author to write more books because I will happily read them. I gave this 4.5 stars. I did also start The Kindred by Alicia Dow, but I haven't finished it yet as of filming this, so you'll most likely see that one next month. But overall, this was one of my favorite reading months, and I hope you enjoyed learning some more about these books. In the comments down below, let me know if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, or feel free to share what you're planning to read next. But that's everything I had to share for this wrap-up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.